All right, so welcome to the 2023 Electricity ATB webinar. Our agenda for today will consist of an introduction and an overview, updates including changes affecting all technologies, financial cases and methods, and technology-specific updates. We'll have a few minutes for questions and comments as a larger group before we head off to the breakout rooms. So to start, why the ATB? Ever-changing technologies result in conflicting reports of technology progress based on inconsistent and often opaque assumptions. A single data set is needed to credibly and transparently assess the evolving state of energy technologies in the United States, and the annual technology baseline enables understanding of technology cost and performance across energy sectors and thus informs electric sector analysis nationwide. So to give an overview of the project, the annual technology baseline anchors key Department of Energy and national lab analyses. Tools such as the resource planning model, the regional energy deployment system, and the system advisor model use ATB data, and it's used in important scenario analyses such as the recent evaluating impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law on the US power system, and the Los Angeles 100% renewable energy study. Now in its 9th year, the ATB is frequently used by planners, academics, analysts, and others, including federal agencies, grid operators, utilities, consultants, nonprofits, academia, and many others. And the users on this slide are just examples of users. This is not a comprehensive list. The ATB data also provide inputs for the standard scenarios. So the ATB presents cost and performance assumptions for renewable and conventional technologies. And in the standard scenarios, runs an ensemble of future scenarios for the US electric power sector, which is presented as its own analysis and report, and also feeds into other NREL tools analyses, such as the slope model for state and local energy planning and the Cambium model, which is a much more detailed hourly analysis of key scenarios. The ATB includes a suite of products, including a spreadsheet with calculations and cost and performance assumptions, a web application with documentation, user guidance, and additional analyses, interactive charts, Tableau workbooks, and formatted data, which can be accessed via an application programming interface, published via the Open Energy Data Initiative, or ODI, and this PowerPoint presentation. And then I'd also like to note that coming soon, we will release open source Python code for levelized cost of energy and debt fraction calculations. We're hoping to do that in a month or so. But you'll be the first to know if you register at that ATB website register link for the ATB email list, because that's where we will post the launch announcement. So the ATB provides cost and performance data, including metrics such as capital expenditures, operation and maintenance costs, and capacity factors. We provide historical data for base year, which for this edition of the ATB is 2021, and then provide projections out to 2050. And these are provided for each year in that data set. All of the different resource classes within a given technology and a wide variety of technologies. We then combine those with financial assumptions to calculate the levelized cost of energy, which is provided as a summary metric of technological improvement, but is not used as an input to the models mentioned on the previous slides. This slide summarizes the technologies covered in the ATB. I would note that new in 2023 include natural gas fuel cell technologies and retrofits for gas and coal technologies. In case you missed it, we issued a mid-year update to the 2022 ATB, which provided the higher carbon capture and sequestration rates listed in that slide. The methodology of the ATB includes 3 steps. We define resource bins for each technology. We group range of resources for the contiguous United States into bins with common resource quality and characteristics. So for example, that would be global horizontal irradiance for solar PV, or average annual wind speed for land-based wind. Or in cases where that's a less relevant way to bin a technology, we develop representative plants as we do for geothermal and natural gas. We also refer to these throughout the data as tech details. Once we have those categorizations, we develop cost and performance data. And so that includes both that base year and projected values across conservative, moderate, and advanced technology scenarios for metrics including capital expenditures, capacity factors, and operations and maintenance. And then we use those along with 2 sets of financial assumptions in order to calculate the levelized cost of energy. So this summarizes the resource bins or resource bin categories and what defines them for each technology. Technologies in bold had changes for this year. So relative to last year, land-based wind, natural gas, coal, and the new retrofits technologies have different bins from last year, and we'll get into more details of those in the technology-specific updates section. Here's an example of how those bins are defined for land-based wind. So on the left, you see the average annual wind speed for 100 meters above surface level in North America. And then we use that in order to develop a supply curve. And you can see an example of how those might be binned based on the availability of resource along the cumulative capacity of the supply curve. So generally, we have a little bit more density in the higher resource classes that are more likely to be built, and a little bit less density in the bins in the lower resource classes. For step 2, we develop cost and performance data starting with a base year, which for this year is 2021, which is informed by market reports, market data, and bottom-up modeling. We're using this 2-year lag in the annual technology baseline in order to ensure that these reports can be peer-reviewed and meet our standards for the data that we include. And then projections for subsequent years generally rely on bottom-up modeling and/or published studies, and we qualitatively harmonize those to 3 scenarios of future technology innovation. The conservative scenario assumes today's technology with little innovation, continued industrial learning driving smaller cost declines, but generally a decreased level of public and private R&D relative to what we're seeing right now. The moderate scenario represents widespread adoption of today's cutting edge, is what we would categorize as roughly the expected level of innovation, and assumes that current levels of public and private R&D continue. And then the advanced technology scenario relies on market success of a currently unproven innovation or multiple currently unproven innovations, assumes new technology architectures achieve widespread adoption in the market, and represents a potential increase in public and private R&D relative to current levels. This slide summarizes the sources of base year costs. I'm not going to read all of this off to you now. And for technologies with significant changes versus previous years of the ATB, we'll be summarizing these in the technology-specific updates section. But when we publish these slides, all of those links are clickable, and we'll link you to the exact reports so you can see detailed assumptions that we use. And then once we've developed these cost and performance assumptions, we can combine these with 2 financial cases in order to develop estimates of the levelized cost of energy. I would emphasize that LCOE is a summary metric with important limitations. Specifically, it is quantifying the costs of technologies, but not necessarily the benefits for a specific system. And so we have more on that and what we recommend for use of LCOE in the documentation on the website. So with that, I will summarize the changes to all technologies. So in previous editions of the ATB, we would define costs in the base year, and then technologies would look at intermediate points in, say, 2030 or 2050, and then fit straight lines to those, or use continuous learning curves from the base year. 2022 is already over, and we know that prices increased in real terms. So if you looked at the increase in costs of renewable technologies relative to the consumer price index from 2021 to 2022, there was an increase in many of these technologies above and beyond just general economic inflation. So all of the data in the ATB is represented in a constant 2021 dollar year, but we wanted to represent these price increases in real terms. So when available, technologies use technology-specific reports. Or if they did not have specific reports that they were able to rely on, we used a technology neutral average of 3.5% of a real price increase to specify costs for 2022. And we'll see that pretty clearly in the data when we get to graphs with the updated data. Additionally, most technologies publish additional data on their cost reduction assumptions. So if you go to the website, the documentation has a new section titled Scenario Assumptions, and this covers how the analysts arrived at the cost reductions by scenario, including specifics on what learning rates were used and what deployment assumptions went into those learning rates if the technologies use learning rates as their underlying methodology. And some use bottom-up cost models for specific years. Also new this year are maturity metrics. The ATB typically represents some technologies that are not currently commercial in the market. And until this edition, it was not necessarily clear which was which on a very quick glance. And so we're trying to make that more obvious this year. In order to sort these bins or tech details by what's mature versus what's nascent, we use the definition of technology details are defined as mature if a representative plant is operating or under construction in the United States in the base year. So we'll get into a little bit more how that definition fell out relative to our tech details, but it's roughly the same as what standard scenarios published in 2022. So for an example of that, we have a summary chart from the geothermal technology below. On the left side under the mature column is a conventional hydro flash plant. And then on the right side under the nascent column are enhanced geothermal systems. So you'll see that throughout the data when within a given technology, there are both nascent and mature technology details. We also had significant updates to our financial cases and methods this year. So this is something that David Feldman and I worked out and applied to the technologies, including the Inflation Reduction Act. So in the ATB, we have two financial cases. The R&D case has specified technology-specific interest rates and debt fractions, but then holds those constant throughout the analysis, such that the analysis shows only the influence of technological innovation. And so if you see that little R&D on a graph, that means that's the financial scenario that you're looking at. We also present a markets and policies scenario, which utilizes those same debt fractions, interest rates, and return on equity in the base year, but then adds in the effects of tax credits on the Inflation Reduction Act, which will, or from the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll discuss more in the following slides. And so then if you see that little market on the graph, that means that's the financial assumptions scenario that you are looking at. So this slide summarizes the changes. The 2022 ATB had a base year of 2020. This year we've updated both the base year, so which year is set up by market reports, and then the dollar year to 2021. I would note that there's been, 2022 had a significant amount of inflation. So if the prices look a little low relative to what you're seeing in the current market, do inflate those to current dollars. But then throughout the ATB, historical data and just about every other metric that, unless otherwise indicated, that has a units of dollars is in that 2021 dollars. We saw a significant increase in interest rates in 2022. So we increased interest rates 3 percentage points across the board from the 2022 ATB base year values for both financial cases. So for an example, solar PV is now looking at interest rates of 7%. And construction financing interest rates of 6.5%. So we kept the same differential between term interest and construction interest from the previous ATB, just increased everything. For cost of equity, we increased that 1%. We expect that to increase a little with the current, relative to the interest rates, but it is not a one-to-one correlation based on the reports that we were seeing. We've updated the tax credits in the markets and policies case to include a simplified representation of the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the key assumptions there is when are the tax credits going to phase out? So the tax credits are guaranteed at least through 2032, but the phase out can be affected by when the electric sector hits a 75% reduction in CO2 emissions relative to 2022 values. So in order to determine that for our base case, we looked at these 2022 standard scenarios mid-case, and that hit that threshold in 2038. The specific tax credits we used assumes that the labor requirements of the Inflation Reduction Act are met, but no bonus credits are received. So that results in a 30% ITC and a $27.50 per megawatt hour production tax credit. But that's $27.50 is in 2022 dollars. So we had to deflate that to 2021 dollars for the report. So there may be bonus credits for your project, such as domestic content or energy communities, and you would want to adjust the tax credit values for LCOE in order to get that to apply to your specific project. But we'll cover that more in the financial assumptions and Inflation Reduction Act breakout session. And then with those assumptions, we used system advisor model to calculate debt fractions. And new this year for the markets case, those debt fractions are now calculated on an annual basis. So we are now including the performance improvements and cost declines in some of those out year debt fractions. To get into a little bit more specifics, for our financial scenarios, we're relying on this report from David Feldman, Mark Bollinger, and Paul Schwab, current and future costs of renewable energy project finance across technologies. So the interest rates and cost of equity assumptions have been updated from that report based on more recent data. But generally, we feel that the debt service coverage ratios that were given to us from industry in that report are still consistent for current projects. So you can see a summary of those debt service coverage ratios that we use to determine the debt fractions in the bottom slide. Those are the points from industry that they got in this report, and we use those in our calculations. So we include costs for both financing during the construction period and the operating period, and use different interest rates assumptions during those different periods in order to account for different levels of risk. So to summarize the financial assumptions, we have a few more slides here, including the assumptions for the investment tax credit and production tax credit, including which technology we assume to receive which, the debt fractions that we calculated, the weighted average cost of capital, and then the levelized cost of energy. So this graphic represents which technologies receive the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. So generally, for many of the out years, utility scale photovoltaics, distributed wind, and land-based wind are receiving the production tax credit, and other technologies are receiving the investment tax credit. So I mentioned on a previous slide that those tax credits start to phase out in 2038. The phase out occurs over 4 years, and then in addition to that, we assign most technologies a 4-year safe harbor, meaning that if you start construction, you have 4 years then until your commercial online date, in which you still may be able to receive the credit if you meet certain requirements. So that's the reason that the credits don't totally phase out until about 2046. If you add up, 2038 plus the safe harbor plus the phase out, that's why the line goes down to 0. And then offshore wind has a longer safe harbor, so its phase out doesn't start until even later. The one line that's coming down sooner is distributed PV, which is specified as a specific date in the tax law and is not dependent upon that electric sector carbon value. Given those previous assumptions, this is what we calculated for the term debt fraction. So you can see on the right, in the R&D case, you have those constant assumptions over time, ranging from about 55% for natural gas up to in the mid 70% for commercial PV. On the left, we have the market assumptions. And so you can see generally technologies have a lower debt fraction such that there is some tax appetite for those tax credits until the tax credits phase out, and then they snap up to higher values in the late 2040s. The few technologies such as utility scale PV and land-based wind that continue to decline over time, that's seeing that decrease in cost and increase in performance, requiring more and more tax appetite in order to use those high production tax credit values. And similar story with the weighted average cost of capital. Generally, equity is more expensive than debt. And so as those debt fractions go down, the cost of capital is going to increase. So, you see that high line going for land-based wind on the left side, and then things come down as the amount of debt increases again once the tax credits phase out. And then here's a summary and comparison of levelized cost of energy between the two cases. So you can see here in 2022, the result of that spike in capital costs, a general decline driven by technology innovation. And then in Mark's case, things come back up as the tax credits phase out. And then relative to the R&D case, even with the higher cost of capital, the tax credits are lowering technology costs relative to the R&D case where we hold finances constant. We get some very low LCOE values for a few technologies in the 2030s with the tax credits. All right, with that, we'll get into technology-specific updates. So these two slides summarize the changes by technology. This information is also available on the website. For today, we'll be covering technologies with larger changes relative to last year, which includes land-based wind, PV, geothermal, battery storage, and natural gas and coal. And with that, I will hand things off to Tyler.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so my name is Tyler Staley. I was one of the analysts that supported the land-based wind estimates for the ATB, along with a few other analysts listed on this slide. But yeah, I'm here to speak very high level at what the changes were from last year's versus this year's ATB for land-based wind. So the scenarios are quite a bit different from methods used in previous editions. In prior editions, each scenario for the land-based wind assumed one wind turbine technology characteristics and projected specific innovations to overcome things like transportation challenges, advanced wind turbine controls, and increase the adoption of science-based modeling. So in the 2023 ATB, we introduced multiple wind turbine technology configurations, and they're each developed independently and separately, which allows for different technologies to be used within each scenario. So the scenarios now consider 4 different technologies configurations, each with 3 different cost and performance projections. So the additional technology configurations also enable placement of appropriate wind turbines in each wind resource class, so representing the range of technology that we'd expect to be available in 2030. So this includes higher specific power machines that may be more suitable for, say, land constrained sites. Turbine ratings range from now 3.3 megawatts to about 8.3 megawatts. With rotor diameter variations between 148 and 196 meters, and hub heights from 100 meters to 140 meters. The analysis also now includes an assessment of 3 scenarios for each of the 4 representative wind turbine configurations, and are informed by bottom-up engineering-based models, literature, data, and learning rates. All the additional details should be listed in the documentation on the ATB website for further digging into those. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, on this slide here, it's showing the default wind class 4 in the graphic. So this is similar to an average site you'd find in the wind belt of the United States. This is representative of a single wind turbine technology suitable for this wind class over time. So the primary inputs to calculate LCOE are being displayed here from the base year of 2021 projected out to 2050. Our capacity factor estimates from technologies are derived for technology specific machines. So power curves are derived based on the characteristics of the machine. And then we assume improvements to system capacity factors through wind turbine and plant advanced controls to reduce system losses. The CapEx in 2022, you'll see it increases from the 2021 value. This is due to supply chain stresses, high commodity prices, and increased logistics costs.
One theory review done. ATB webinar now, all going today, all going.
The CapEx in 2023 also estimates increased values in 2021. But assumes a downward trend from the 2022 values. And then we assume that this will start to begin to level out in 2024 and beyond. O&M cost values are informed by a recent O&M literature review and now vary by wind turbine rating. So we assume greater cost reductions resulting from larger machine ratings between these, for the 4 that we've introduced in this year's ATB. And the resulting LCOE cost trajectory is a combination of these factors. And again, this represents one technology pathway among many other possible combinations. Next slide, please. Great. So yeah, this slide summarizes a year-over-year update. So 2022 versus 2023 ATB. These are a summary of the default wind class values within each year. So I wanted to, warn caution here that this comparison is not a direct comparison, since we're changing the technology assumptions from last year to this year. For example, the base year wind turbine rating in the 2022 ATB assumes a market average of a 2.8 megawatt machine, and it steps to a 5.5 megawatt machine for the moderate scenario in 2030. Whereas in the 2023 ATB, we report data for a 6 megawatt wind turbine from the base year to 2030. So the technology stays the same in this year's ATB, so it's not a direct comparison. The 2022 ATB CapEx does not reflect supply chain stresses, increased commodity prices, or higher logistics costs. Other differences include refined bottom-up engineering cost models that results in different dollars per kilowatt for this year's update. Capacity factors also have differences from the assumed technology differences, but illustrate similar reductions in wind turbine and plant losses to increase capacity factors over time. The O&M estimates differ from the assumed reductions in O&M costs with turbine ratings. So in the case of moving from a 2.8 megawatt to a 6 megawatt in the basis year, you will see a large difference there. It's reflected in the graphic. Finally, the LCOE trajectories land on similar levels between the two ATB versions for this particular default case. But yeah, users may see larger variations among other scenarios and different comparisons between the scenarios. So I think that's it for the land-based wind updates on my end. I think I'll pass it over to Jared to cover solar PV. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Appreciate that. So we're going to talk a little bit about PV. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I mean, I guess basically, first paragraph here says we changed our references. So we have even the base year is 2021, but we have a 2022 reference for solar CapEx that we used for PV CapEx, and then that also use that reference for O&M. And the projections, we made a slight modification to the inverter loading ratio based on Lawrence Berkeley's Track the Sun data. And then we calculate projections using our 2022 report to as the starting point for the projections. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a little more detail. I think, one change here is the sort of projection year was 2030 last year, now it's 2035. So I've kind of normalized things, looking at, PV is quite a bit higher projected cost in 2030 this year than it was last year. And this just kind of lists out some of those reasons. Some of these reasons apply to everything in the ATB, and some of the things are solar specific. And, we could talk about some of these things in the breakout rooms if we need more detail, if anybody's interested in that. But for one thing, the benchmarks in 2022 were higher, the costs were higher in 2022. It was in part because of the supply chain issues that Tyler mentioned for wind as well. So I think a lot of technologies experienced that, whereas the supply chain kind of made prices go up faster than inflation. And then we look at our projected cost reductions this year. So we shifted the target year from 2030 to 2035. So there's sort of a methodological choice there to use a straight line method between things, and it kind of creates this geometry when you're stretching out with a straight line that kind of keeps the cost higher in 2030, because of that methodological choice. I think it's safe to say that we will not see a straight line between 2022 and 2035, but we didn't. We're sort of using a simplified method there to make that assumption, and we'll see what unfolds in the real world. Projected module costs changed last year. They were based on a combination of minimum sustainable. This year, they're based on a combination of minimum sustainable price and global spot prices. Whereas last year, they were more spot price based, so they were a bit lower, especially in the conservative and moderate scenarios. We maintained significant hardware supply chain costs for residential and commercial systems, which is something we were seeing based on our more recent data collection, that there's some significant markup for these systems. Installer margin overhead costs are higher going forward. And I have a little bit more detail on that again, the breakout room we could look at, and then the financing assumptions, which applies to every technology in ATB, has pretty big impact. Like if you look at utility scale PV, the difference between the different financing assumptions explains about 65% of the difference in 2030 for utility scale PV in price, and 34% of the difference for residential PV. And the last bullet there is just higher financing assumptions affect all technologies. And the utility scale LCOE did get offset a little bit the increase in price by assuming higher capacity factors, because this year we assumed the use of bifacial modules through all years for utility scale PV based on recent trends. And so that was all sort of discussion of the 2030, 2035 sort of time frame. The 2050 LCOE is also a bit higher this year for similar reasons. And also we assumed a slightly lower module efficiency improvement this year based on the International Technology Roadmap for Photovoltaic. Okay, next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide either. I think our next slide will be a little more interesting, but this is just kind of showing our current results for the utility scale PV here, for each of the scenarios. You can see the bump up in 2022 and CapEx costs, and then a straight line projection to 2035, and then a straight line to 2050. I think let's take the next slide. It'll be a little more interesting, I think, because it'll provide so here we see a comparison for utility scale PV, comparing the different categories, CapEx on the top, capacity factor, next one down, then O&M, then LCOE. And you see the big sort of increase overall through like the 2030, 2035 timeframe there. We see the biggest difference in utility scale PV costs. And then as you get more out towards 2050, they start to come together as that kind of the effect of that early increase in price in 2022, and then the effect of the that straight line method become more muted. And you can also see here in the capacity factor, you get a bit higher in 2023 than 2022 because of the bifacial module assumption. But I think that is it for me, and we're going to hand it over to Dio.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, this is Dio Kinika. I'm going to be talking through the geothermal changes for this year's ATB. First of all, our base year estimates were typically from the GeoVision study, with some slight changes across the board on contingency factor. And so the base contingency factor that is normally used as a default in GETM of 15% has now been slightly downgraded to 10%. And this is based off of discussions with geothermal developers, and also trying to be more consistent across the board relative to other renewable technologies. And another major change is the model assumption for the exploration drilling. Exploration drilling initially used to be about 9 successful wells, but now we have brought it down to about 5 successful wells for EGS. And so this helped, to actually reflect, the successes already, been announced, even as of last week on near field EGS drilling, and how many successful wells are needed to move to commercial development. Also, we followed for the O&M costs, we followed what we did in 2022 by applying a 23% reduction factor on the output, the direct output from GETM. And this is also based on proprietary data from the industry. In terms of projections, like Brian has emphasized already, we applied a technology neutral CPI factor to be able to account for, inflationary and supply chain issues encountered in 2022. So you would see that jump from 2021 to 2022 in the graphs. And beyond 2022, we applied on the conservative case, a 0.5% annual decline based on the annual energy outlook projections. And then for the moderate and the advanced cases, we applied learning curves. So learning curves with specific learning rates. The moderate case had an 18% learning rate, while the advanced case had a 30% learning rate. And these learning rates were from unconventional oil and gas developments. And these were basically learning rates that were heavily biased towards drilling, because drilling costs account for significant, up to 40 to 45% of total costs for geothermal development. And so we apply these learning rates based off of the successes in unconventional drilling, and also based off of discussions with a geothermal developer in the EGS space. And for the moderate and advanced cases, we apply the specific numbers, the specific cost numbers in 2035. And so between 2022 and 2035 is where we apply the learning curve. And then beyond that, up to 2050, we apply the same learning rate as we have in the conservative case. That's a 0.5 annual decline. Next slide, please. So one major thing we were able to do this year was to delineate the DPGS from the near field EGS, because from a technology standpoint, we believe that the near field or the shallower, enhanced geothermal systems will be, more implementable in the near future than the deeper resources. And so, as we've seen already in recent announcements, and so we have delineated both systems, basing the near field EGS on kind of like a brownfield development adjacent to a hydrothermal system. And so we see the reduction in the cost, the CapEx, the fixed O&M, and also the LCOE when comparing the deep to the near field EGS. Capacity factors basically remained constant across the board. And overall, of course, the hydrothermal systems generally will cost lesser because of the, you already have an existing reservoir and you don't really necessarily need to, induce any changes to the reservoir to be able to produce the geothermal fluids. And so let's move to the next slide. And so for comparisons between last year and this year, the major change to the hydrothermal flash system, although we had some significant changes to it, it did not reflect in, especially if you see the LCOE, and this is not because of whether they were not significant in terms of the changes to productivity and injectivity based on industry data. It was just because of the inflationary trends that we've seen when you adjust, to the current year or to the 2021 year. And so we were not able to see actual, reductions on a nominal basis with compared to the previous year. But if you go to the next slide, in the near field EGS, you would see the significant reduction in costs, whether it's CapEx or LCOE, for the near field EGS, and showing, and this is across whether it's binary or flash, and these reductions are basically saying that we are assuming slightly better productivity and injectivity based off of successes already being announced in the Forge and by a geothermal developer, by Fervo. And so we made those adjustments prior to this year's announcement of the ATB. And this is, and also we made significant adjustments to the drilling success rates, improving them by a couple of percentage points. So for example, for the exploration success rates, we increased them from about 51 to about 76%. and also the developmental and drilling success rates were increased by 2 percentage points as well. And so these improvements in geothermal development over the past 1 year, has led to significant reduction in cost, mostly for the EGS resources. And so I'll be happy to talk through these changes in the breakout sessions if there's any questions. Thanks. I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Sorry, I don't have the list here for battery storage. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's good to be with you today. Battery storage in the ATB is handled a little bit differently than the other technologies. So the initial CapEx estimates are based on bottom-up modeling that's pretty detailed. There's a lot of market work that Vignesh Ramasamy leads. So that's what builds that initial starting cost. And then the projections, this is where the primary difference relative to other technologies is we're not looking out and saying this is what we think a battery will look like in 2030 or 2040, and therefore this is what we think the cost will be. The projections are based on a literature survey where we're looking at projections out there for what people say batteries are going to cost over the next decade or 2 or 3, and then use those to develop a low, mid, and high projection or advanced, moderate, conservative projections. So that's the way these are built, which is a little bit different than the other technologies. Let's go to the next slide. So we do that, we get this, the top showing the fixed O&M, the bottom one showing the OCC or the overnight capital cost. So you'd see the conservative projection, higher projection is actually increasing, not just to 2022, but also out into the next couple of years, showing continued increases. And then the lowest case, the advanced projection, showing rapid decreases basically immediately that then persist over time. And this is reflective of what we saw in the literature. And when we pulled things, we made sure to pull only really recent stuff so it would capture supply chain issues and other things. So this spread, even in the immediate term, is real out there in terms of what analysts think might happen to prices. Some people say that they're still going to go up. Other people say that we basically passed through it, they're going to drop really fast again. So that's captured in this range of projections. And then if you want to go to the next slide, this shows what that looks like relative to last year. So as you can see, last year there was a smooth decline. Over time, you can see that bump up in the near term, that it's effectively in the initial year, that much higher costs due to both higher pricing in like these supply chain constraints, as well as the getting more robust in that bottom-up cost analysis to better, make sure the battery sized right to deal with state of charge constraints and degradation, all those pieces. So all those pieces lead to a higher initial cost. A lot of that, by the time you get out to 2050, the gap versus last year is pretty narrow, but still a little bit higher, due to, I think, better, more rigorous evaluation of what the battery what the needs are in order to build a robust battery to last over the lifetime that we project for the ATB. So that's a summary of utility scale battery storage. Happy to talk more about that in the breakout session, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what's in there. And I just want to highlight that one piece for this is people have been asked, like, was there no ITC in this? Well, batteries do qualify for an ITC. We didn't put that in here because it's not part of the LCOE calculations. We don't put an LCOE for batteries in the ATB, so it's part of why that's not in there. So anyway, I'll turn it back to, I think, Brian. You're back on with this.
Okay, thanks, Wesley. So this is work presented from the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and lead analyst is Jeff Hoffman. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it today, so you get to hear from me on some of the new fossil energy changes. So the Office of FECM and the National Energy Technology Laboratory published several new papers that were relevant to the ATB, which are summarized on this slide. Generally, we're looking at projects that are representative of current commercial offerings and or projects that could begin commercial service within the past 10 years. And the key references there are listed. If you've heard of Rev 4A from them, that's that first Schmidt et al. Reference, which is what we used to update the carbon capture and storage rates to 95% in the mid-year update. And then the cost declines for these technologies are based on the cost decline trajectories from the Energy Information Administration's 2023 annual energy outlook. So we're using these FECM and NREL reports for base year data, and then the EIA data for declines. Next slide. So this summarizes the key trajectories for both mature unmitigated technologies and nascent technologies with CCS for both coal and natural gas. And then one new thing here you can see coming in on the nascent line in 2035 are the natural gas fuel cell technologies. So that was how they wanted to indicate this as a nascent technology that won't be available for a few years. But we are distinguishing that as its own trajectory, independent of the natural gas combined cycle technology. Those two were combined in previous ATBs, and we've made them distinct for this year. Next slide. So this shows the year over year for the cost projections. So we are seeing increases both in CapEx and in fixed O&M. CapEx relative to last year, fixed O&M starts a little bit higher and then declines. And I will note that we do not present levelized cost of energy for the fossil energy technologies. Some of these underlying reports have their own LCOE numbers, typically presented in 2018 dollars with their own fuel cost assumptions. So if you're looking for an LCOE for those technologies, we recommend you go there. And next slide. And then also new this year are retrofits. So things of note for retrofits. These are a representative retrofit. There's a carbon capture retrofit database that has a ton of useful plant-specific info for more detailed analysis. But we wanted to be able to provide this data in order to generate a comparison of a new build with CCS to retrofitting an existing plant with CCS. So we do this both for coal and natural gas. The expectation is that the capture rate for these plants would be lower than a new build. So for new builds, for gas, for example, we're presenting a 95 and 97% capture rate. For retrofits, that's 90 and 95. And so the retrofit data includes the additional overnight capital cost in order to perform the retrofit, a heat rate penalty to the plant based on the retrofit, as well as a net output penalty. And I will note that all for both the new build CCS and the retrofits, all costs are within the fence line of the plant and do not include costs for CO2 transportation and storage. So that's an additional cost that should be accounted for with these plant costs. And I think that's it for fossil energy. So we have a couple of slides of sort of back matter here for references. We have a long list of references on the website. Next slide. Acronyms and abbreviations used throughout the documentation in this presentation. Thank you to the team. It takes a huge team to put this together. Many of these folks are on the call. Couldn't do it without them. Really appreciate all of the hard work that all of these folks put in. And with that, thank you. And I think we're ready for live Q&A.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Laura Vimmerstedt. I'm the overall ATB project lead, and I have been answering a lot of wonderful questions in the chat. As we roll into Q&A, I encourage everyone to continue to pose questions in the chat. That's the avenue to pose questions here in the webinar. As Daniela mentioned at the beginning, you'll have the opportunity to interact directly with the project team in the breakout sessions, but here in the webinar, please pose your questions live. And there have been several questions about the IRA. I wonder if someone from the team would like to field some of those to get us kicked off here.
Sure, I'll grab two of those. So one was for technologies that qualify for either the PTC or ITC, how did you decide which to apply? We did that on a levelized cost of energy basis. So whichever tax credit led to the lower LCOE for the default technology class for that technology, that's what we applied to the whole technology. So I would note that if you're in a higher capital cost, lower resource class area, that might be the reverse for your specific project. So we definitely recommend doing things on a project by project basis rather than just adopting our assumptions a little bit, whole cloth.
And Wesley, I saw you come on screen. Did
Well,
you?
I just want to echo that last piece from Brian that we put this stuff in the ATB to try and be helpful for you, but don't say it's in the ATB, therefore that is the truth. There's so many nuances associated with how much tax credit you get in a different location and for different technology. So it's there and you could edit it and get new numbers if you're working in the spreadsheet or what. So definitely it's there to be useful to you. We're interested in if you have feedback, how we make more useful, definitely give us that. But there's a lot of other analysis out there in terms of how these things are impacted by the evolving grid or by different conditions or locations that can influence tax credit values.
And I would give everyone the fair warning, and this is explicit in the spreadsheet, is you can't just change the tax credit value. If you change the tax credit value, you also have to change the debt fraction. And so I'll be giving a quick tutorial of the way that we did it in the breakout room, which I'll keep shamelessly plugging until they mute me.
Wesley, before you go, did you want to address any of the questions on batteries?
Sure. And so a few pieces. One, there's a lot of questions about batteries. So one, you come to the breakout room, we're happy to have as much discussion as you want. Then other pieces, the batteries, we use a lifetime of 15 years. So when that's part of, there's the default cost recovery in ATB is 30 years. So people, how does that jive with batteries? Well, this is part of, we don't report an LCOE for a battery. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the cost recovery period is only relevant if you're calculating those financial metrics. If you're not, then the cost recovery period is whatever you and your project are evaluating. So definitely when we do our own modeling and we're doing cost recovery periods that are longer than 15 years, we make adjustments to deal with that. You're gonna have to replace the battery before the cost recovery period's over. There are a lot of questions about what's the appropriate lifetime. Is 10 to 15 years the right lifetime? Should be something different. There's a lot of different ways you can operate the battery. The way you operate the battery will impact the lifetime. 15 years is the most common value we've seen out there. The batteries, the large scale, 4-hour batteries are too new to know what their actual lifetimes are going to be. We have no real data on what a 15-year-old 4-hour battery looks like because there aren't any of those yet at large scale. So this is still a TBD, and you'll see people out there who say they're going to last 8 years. Some people say they're going to last 30 years. So it depends on the chemistry, depends on your state of charge management, depends on the cycling. So there's a lot of different pieces out there for batteries. And then the last one I'll answer here, and then I'll go elsewhere, is just that conservative cases showing continued increases for batteries, and the others show decreases immediately, and that's just a reflection of what various analysts see for the future of battery storage in the near term. And these are all from recent projections, so there's a lot of discrepancy in terms of what batteries are going to cost in the immediate future. That's reflected in that range of uncertainty.
And if Wesley didn't answer your question here, I'd encourage you to attend the session that includes battery storage, where Wesley will be available for more questions. One other theme.
Jump in with
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, on the battery degradation topic. I would note that the 2022 ATB, the assumptions between the PV battery hybrid technology and the standalone battery on degradation and lifetime were a little bit inconsistent. We've made those consistent with this addition. So both technologies are assuming a 15-year battery, and then the O&M cost for the PV plus battery technology levelizes a replacement at 15 years. So if you look at the year-over-year chart, the O&M for PV plus battery is up pretty significantly, and that's the reason why.
Thanks a lot, Brian. One other theme in the questions on Q&A was regarding questions about geospatial data. And so the annual technology baseline is not really the source for geospatial data at NREL. I did put in the chat the link for geospatial data that NREL provides on the various resources. And you can crosswalk the ATB assumptions to those very granular data sets using the resource class descriptions of the ATB bins. Brian, other questions that you want to address before we wrap up the Q&A?
I think the rest of these might be good for the breakout rooms.